I really can't thank Internet Historian enough for doing a documentary on Floyd Collins. I actually went summer camping in the local area with Boy Scouts growing up, and I never heard the story. Now, to begin with, Floyd Collins started caving when he was only 6 years old. He would go into his family's property because there were several people that lived at the same farm, and he would go in, explore the caves. It's something that he grew up doing. And around the 1920s, Kentucky went through something called the Kentucky Cave Wars. And this was basically property owners didn't really have viable farmland here. It wasn't easy to turn a profit from farming, and as travel became easier for middle class and upper middle class families, people began opening their cave systems up, cleaning them out and marketing them for tourism. However, there were plenty of people who were trying to, rather than beautify their own caves, basically make other caves look dangerous. They even went as far as hiring fake cops to tell them you can't enter, it's dangerous, and it's illegal. They even blocked each other's property off. Well, eventually, Floyd Collins, from his little homestead here, found a cave on his property called Crystal Cave, which he spent 12 hours a day working, cleaning out, really beautifying. And finally, at the end of the cave shaft, about 150 feet down, it collapsed and covered his body, making it very difficult to breathe. And it would have been easy enough to wiggle out if his arms weren't pinned above and beneath him, making it impossible for him to even wiggle. And there was a rock, 26 pounds, lodged at his ankle, which made it basically impossible to pull him out with a rope, although they tried. And it would be 23 hours before people heard him yelling. Now you might ask, why was he down there for so long? Well, his father, Lee, was a bit of an alcoholic, and he lived very often with other people on the property, because again, this was kind of a tenant farm, and there were multiple people that lived on the property. So if he wasn't home one night, then he might be in a different person's house the next. And he was even known to sleep inside of a cave for as long as 30 hours. He was very dedicated to his work. But after 23 hours, people began to suspect that something might be amiss, and when they went to the cave and they saw his jacket still hung up on a hook, they realized something was wrong. And would you just look at how beautiful this river is? It was on the old Floyd Collins family farm, and it was right up here and to the left that the infamous Crystal Cave events of 1925 happened, which would claim the life of Floyd Collins, one of the greatest cave explorers ever known. And throughout all his life, Floyd Collins faced adversity. His mother died when he was younger after a lengthy battle with tuberculosis, and he had to deal with a father who, by most accounts, was at least a little bit of an alcoholic. And then during the Kentucky Cave Wars, and this is where Homer Collins comes into play, Floyd's brother, 5 men showed up to this property, cornered Floyd when nobody was around, and began beating him savagely. And eventually Homer showed up and fired his shotgun into the air, but you can see how serious these cave wars really got. And those men might have actually killed Floyd. Who knows? But you can see what was happening here in the Great Depression in Appalachia. We're on the hunt for the final resting place of Floyd Collins, and this was on his family farm. You can see here a sinkhole, and there's a river over in this direction, and everything here being made of limestone, in spite of the famous song saying it's sandstone. When you have running water moving through limestone, you get the massive cave network that is now Mammoth Cave National Park. And if Lee Collins, his father, would have handled his finances a little bit better, the family could still be rich today from the money the government would have paid them for the land, or at least been well-to-do for the rest of Homer Collins' life. The Collins family homestead is only about a quarter mile up in that direction, while Sand Cave, or as Floyd called it, Crystal Cave, is right here. Now, the trouble all began January 30th, 1925. Floyd had been in this cave 12 hours a day for months on end, opening the chute, which can be found after about a 5-foot-tall opening. He recognized the beauty of Crystal Cave. It was covered in gypsum crystals, and if he could only beautify it and access the main chamber of the cave, he knew that he could make his family rich for generations. And his father, Lee, objected to this, saying that he should just stay steady with agricultural work, but Floyd was an adventurous person. So the geography of the cave itself, in which he got lost, is a 5-foot opening followed by about a 100-foot-long chute or tunnel leading to the turnaround room. Now, why do they call it the turnaround room? Well, that's the room where even experienced climbers and cavers decide to simply turn back. Now, the reason they would turn back is because beyond the turnaround room, there was a little wall that had a 9-inch gap. You would have to exhale just to basically like close your abdomen so that you could fit through. And Floyd saw the need to fit through this room every time he entered the cave system to clear out the inside of the following chamber, which would open up to the beautiful crystal cavern. Now, this is what he did on January 30th, 1925. He entered through that one side, and on his way out, his lamp flickered out. And he didn't think anything of it. He'd been in things like that before. He could feel his way out of the cave, and that is when a 26-pound rock collapsed on his foot. It ached, but it pinned it in place, and after a small gravel avalanche from directly above him, he was in a small chute, it collapsed and it pinned him to the ground. And it took 23 hours for someone to realize he was in there. By the time Floyd's beloved brother, Homer, got a telegram saying that Floyd was in the cave, he'd actually been down there for well over a full day and night. And the story goes that Homer didn't even bother changing his fancy new business suit he'd picked up in Louisville. He took the tram immediately to the Collins family farm and found a crowd of people standing around offering stupid advice. The reason for this is because they all reached the turnaround room and turned around. When Homer got in there, he took a deep breath, went through the squeeze, the 9-inch squeeze, and started moving dirt. And he did this for hours. When he got out, he found an even larger crowd offering stupid advice, ranging from cutting his legs off, to lighting dynamite, to finally just wrapping a rope around him and pulling. And that is when the newspaper editor, William Skeets Miller, who would later get a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting of the incident, came up and tried to interview Homer Collins. Well, Homer didn't want to say buzz off right away, so he started giving kind of very short answers, trying to show his contempt without outright saying it. Yeah, he's my brother. No, I don't know how I got in there. Things like that. And finally, he was fed up with the interview, and he told William, well, if you want to go see him, go down there and talk to him yourself, figuring that he would reach the turnaround room and turn around. Well, he got to the turnaround room, and he yelled out, "Floyd, are you there?" And he heard a voice call back. And Miller said that he wouldn't have stayed if it weren't for the sense of guilt he felt leaving. So he decided to push through the 9-cent squeeze and onward to Floyd Collins. And he found him there in a 50-degree pool of water. So he began working for hours, emptying out dirt from around him. And when he made his way back to Homer Collins, Homer decided that he had made a friend. This was the only other man so far who'd made it to his brother and actually tried helping in a common sense way. And so the two pushed on and others would join, but every time they came up, they would find more and more just looky-loos and idiot tourists staring at the work going on, and their campfires were even destabilizing the cave system, because this is all very, very loosely compacted clay. And it's pretty cool how open this place is. I would have expected it to be a much larger tourist attraction, but this is Floyd Collins' old home, and it's wide open. In fact, the adjacent building to this is kind of abandoned. It looks like it's not really upkept all that well. I think they should turn it into a museum about the life of Floyd Collins. Homer also went on to save his brother Floyd after they'd removed enough dirt from around his legs to wrap a rope under him. Someone suggested it was a lanky fireman who came from up in Louisville that actually had the courage to go in the 9-cent squeeze, that they pull him out. And Homer and Floyd both agreed that was a good idea, but his leg was pinned under that 26-pound rock, which wedged it in against the wall of the cave. And as the 6 men began pulling, Floyd Collins was crying out, and this is even after quite a bit of gin and some food and a sedative. He's screaming to please stop, and he's panting, and finally his brother Homer, who hears all this happening, he's actually one of the 6 men pulling, he flips around and pulls the opposite direction. So it's now Homer Collins versus 5 fully grown men, one of them a firefighter, and he manages to pull all of them back. And I think that if he hadn't have done this, it's very likely that Floyd Collins' leg would have broken and he would have gone into shock and died very, very quickly after. So, for the time being, Floyd's life had been spared. And would you look at that? I always loved seeing the handiwork of beavers. It's what drew French fur trappers into this region before the Revolutionary War. At this point, Floyd Collins has been stuck in Crystal Cave about 100 feet back and 60 feet down for 4 days. That's when his friend Johnny Gerald shows up. Johnny actually had a good deal of experience in rescuing lost cavers, so he scrambled down the entrance to the sandy cave and began the original strategy of simply removing dirt. He started with his bare hands, but his stamina was so great that he was able to get 1,000 pounds off. Once he got enough room, he started scraping it out with tin cans and even managed to get down to Floyd Collins's waist, hips, and it removed all of the strain that made it difficult for him to breathe. And he noticed when he was down there, about 4 days in, that someone had the idea, which seemed good at the time, to run light bulbs into the cave. Now, these did two things. One, they kept him warm because someone had taken a light bulb and put it on his chest. And two, they destabilized the walls, and it was around the time that Johnny Gerald left the mouth of the cave that he saw Henry Carmichael, the owner of an asphalt company, had showed up with a number of his employees and National Guard with him. And he sent in 2 employees to do a survey. This is at the 5th day he's in the cave, and one of the employees that is brave enough to enter the squeeze, a man named Casey Jones, sees that the entire cave, which has been destabilized, is basically getting smaller as he goes in. And he sees that the walls have been expanding and contracting as the lights melt the ice and frost on the sides. And he unfortunately has to leave. And Floyd Collins is begging him to stay, and he has to basically scramble out as the cave is collapsing around him. And that's 5 days in. After this, everybody up on the surface is basically in a riot. They're all offering the dumbest solutions possible and saying, why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do that? Why didn't we run him a phone? Why don't we have a feeding tube down there for him? Why didn't we put supplies down there for him? But the light is keeping him warm for several more days. That light bulb may have saved him. Thanks to the help of some good journalists, the entire country is now paying attention to the plight of Floyd Collins. It also helped that everybody now had a radio. It became more widespread to actually own them. And the papers also carried the story as well. It was something that captivated an entire nation. So along comes Lieutenant General Denhart, along with his men, to begin digging in the mouth of the cave. However, they quickly come to realize that the cave takes air in, and all of their heavy construction equipment only pulls it into the cave. So before too long, the cave would have filled with carbon monoxide, so it takes another couple days to remove all of that equipment, and this is just more and more time. However, it seems to be that Floyd Collins is somehow still surviving because an engineer hooked up a meter to the light bulb and saw that there was a change in resistance at about 20 beats per minute, indicating that he was still breathing deep in the mouth of Sand Cave. So the general finally decides to move all of his men up to the surface and begin the slow dig down. The estimate is that they can move at 2 feet per hour, and it would take them several days to get there, but they are confident that they'll be able to reach him in time. But this is around the time that false rumors begin spreading because people see his father, Lee Collins, moving around with a cup soliciting donations, and rumors are flying that Floyd has been murdered and that the general is soliciting money, and eventually there is a 2-day-long court-martial, very hastily assembled, and in that time, the light burnt out. Well, eventually, Floyd would die, and it took quite a while for his brother to raise up the money to dig his brother up, where he was buried next to his mother, who was buried right here under a stalagmite. But his story does not end there. And this may actually be where the military and the construction engineers had to dig down after Floyd had already died, the cave entrance being over that way. And they had to dig down 55 feet to reach him, and they missed him by only a couple days. They probably could have reached him if it weren't for that court-martial and those 2 absolute idiots sending a telegram to Floyd's mother, who'd been dead for several years, saying, "Hey, it's Floyd, tell everybody I'm not dead." So after 15 brutal days, the military finally reached him and saw the glint of their lanterns off Floyd's golden tooth, and they decided that the dig to actually remove his body would be too expensive and take up too many man-hours, so they decided to leave him there. And Floyd's brother Homer took a job performing vaudeville, basically just to recuperate enough money to give his brother a proper grave here next to his mother. And that's what he finally did. It took several months, and it was April 17th, 1925, and that is closer to the date right there that he's buried. The grave says April 1925, when in reality he probably died, I believe, sometime February 16th, 1925. And this story truly takes a wild turn several years later in 1927. Understand that Floyd's father, Lee, sold the property to a dentist in Cave City for a very small amount of money. It was about $10,000. And Homer objected to this. Again, he said, "Dad, why are you doing this? Now the government is coming around and paying people at very competitive rates. Just wait a few years and you can make 10 times this money." But Lee was a little bit senile and he just wanted the money now. So he sold to the dentist at a very, very discounted price, but didn't read the contract. Now, the contract said that the dentist owned the entire property and could do what he wanted with the property. And because Floyd was originally buried in the family cemetery over next to where his father, Lee, is now buried, they haven't relocated him to this Baptist church yet, he dug his body up and displayed him in a crystal coffin, charging people 50 cents per person to see Floyd Collins' rotting body. And it wouldn't be until 1989, years after the national parks had actually acquired this property, before he was reinterred here in front of the Baptist church next to his mother. And I believe his mother was moved along with him. Homer Collins couldn't stand to live in the local area because it brought back too many poor memories for him of his brother. But here is Martha Collins on the left, who died a couple years before her son, Floyd. And it would be the false telegrams to her urging her to tell the world that "I'm not dead," signed Floyd Collins, that would force the court-martial, which ultimately resulted in his death. And very next to her is James Collins, another one of Floyd's brothers. And over here as well, you have Andy Lee Collins, another brother of Floyd. And the entire Collins family is buried closest to the church. And this is the old Daniels Cemetery on the road to Floyd Collins' homestead, where his father, Lee, is buried. And I hope I don't give Lee too bad of a name, because he was trying to make things work, but he lived on a poor dirt farm. And one of the reasons that Floyd Collins probably wasn't found for 23 hours after he disappeared into the Crystal Cave or Sand Cave is because he and his father, Lee, got into constant arguments. Lee Collins demanded that Floyd continue working on the family farm, and Floyd knew that there would be money in a cave system. And when he found one as beautiful as Crystal Cave, which was absolutely covered in gypsum crystals, Lee didn't think that it was worth exploring, and so the two went head-to-head and began arguing. And Floyd was supported mainly by his brother Homer, while Lee continued to belittle him. So he probably didn't even realize that Floyd was gone, because Floyd, like I said, over at his homestead, would room up with other people, sometimes not show up at night, sometimes sleep in the cave, and Lee was pretty devastated as well. And while their rescuers were down in the cave, he was seen collecting money and donations, which would be used partly by detractors and really just bad people to claim that Lee Collins had concocted this story, maybe even murdered his son and left him in the cave, and that he was collecting money. And after this, there would also be a bit of a rumor that they had were basically just, it was all fraud, and that the military was taking money and that the family was taking money. So they called a court-martial, very hastily assembled, which lasted 2 days. And it was during those 2 days that Floyd Collins died after the light bulb burnt out around his neck. And do you remember the story of Johnny Gerald, who tried to help save Floyd Collins by descending into the cave and removing 1,000 pounds of gravel with his own hands? Well, he had actually saved several other people that were trapped in caves, and sadly, in 1965, just before Christmas, he and a friend were coming back from a fishing trip when they both crashed their car and died, and his wife would go on living until 1990, just after Veterans Day.